There is a man sitting in a prison cell in the city of Bamberg in the year 1628. He has a candle. He has a piece of paper. He has maybe one night left to live. His name is Johannes Junius. Until 3 weeks ago, he was the mayor of this city, a respected man, a man of standing, a man people came to when they needed justice. Now he is writing a letter, in secret, pressed against the cold stone, addressed to his daughter, Veronica. He knows this letter may never reach her.
He writes it anyway. Before this video ends, you will read what he wrote. But not yet. Here is what you need to understand first. Between the years 1400 and 1750, somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed in Europe and colonial America, burned, hanged, pressed under stones, for the crime of witchcraft. Historians debate the exact number. What they do not debate is what happened. What they do not debate is who gave the order.
What they do not debate is that most of those who died were women. Poor women, old women, widows, healers, women who lived alone, women who had no one to speak for them. And the documents that sent them to their deaths were signed, in many cases, by men wearing crosses. This is not a story about witches. This is not a story about superstition in the Dark Ages. This is not a story about ignorant peasants who didn't know any better.
This is a story about power, about what happens when fear becomes policy, when theology becomes a weapon, and when institutions built to protect people turn against them instead. It is also a story about a few remarkable people who said no, who looked at what was happening around them and refused. Their names deserve to be spoken to. But we begin in Bamberg, with a mayor, with a candle, with a letter. Stay with me.
To understand how a city like Bamberg could execute 300 of its own citizens in 5 years, including its own mayor, you have to go back to 1484. That is the year a pope signed a document that changed everything. His name was Pope Innocent VIII. He sat on the throne of St. Peter in Rome at a moment when the Church was simultaneously at the height of its political power and riddled with corruption underneath.
Innocent VIII had at least 8 illegitimate children, a fact so well known that when he died, satirists hung signs near his tomb listing them. He was not a holy man. He was a political man, and in the autumn of 1484, a Dominican friar came to him with a problem. The friar's name was Heinrich Kramer.
He had been traveling through the German principalities for years, trying to prosecute women he believed were practicing harmful magic, what the Latin called maleficium, meaning evil doing. Maleficium was the legal charge, not dancing with the devil, not flying on broomsticks. The charge was causing harm through supernatural means, killing livestock, causing illness, destroying crops, concrete, accusable, arguable things. But Kramer kept running into resistance.
Local bishops didn't want him in their dioceses. Judges dismissed his cases. In the city of Innsbruck, the bishop threw him out personally, calling his behavior scandalous and his methods indefensible. Kramer was not deterred. He went to Rome, and Innocent VIII gave him exactly what he wanted. The papal bull was titled Summis Desiderantes Effectivus, which translates roughly as desiring with the deepest longing. It was issued on the 5th of December, 1484, and it authorized Kramer to prosecute suspected witches throughout Germany with the full backing of church authority. Anyone who obstructed him was threatened with excommunication. Here's what most people miss about that document. Pope Innocent VIII almost certainly did not write it himself. The language, the framing, the specific arguments,
They match Kramer's own writing almost exactly. Historians believe Kramer drafted the bull and presented it to the Pope for signature. Innocent signed it, and with that signature, one obsessive, arguably unstable Dominican friar now had the Church of Rome behind him. 2 years later, in 1486, Kramer published the book that would become the operating manual for the next 250 years of witch trials. He called it the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches.
It is a remarkable document, remarkable in the worst possible way. It is part theological argument, part legal manual, part obsession with women's bodies and sexuality that historians have long noted reads as deeply disturbed. It argues at length that women are more susceptible to diabolical influence than men because they are, in Kramer's own words, more carnal, more credulous, and more impressionable. It provides specific instructions for how to conduct a trial.
How to torture a suspect to extract a confession. How to identify a witch's mark, a spot on the skin that supposedly does not bleed when pricked. How to ensure that a confession, once given under torture, is confirmed freely the next day so that it appears voluntary. The Malleus went through 28 editions between 1486 and 1600. 28 editions. It was a bestseller. Now, you might be wondering, was this really the church doing this, or was it secular governments? The honest answer is both. In some regions, witch trials were driven by church courts. In others, by secular magistrates who had absorbed the church's theology. The Malleus Maleficarum crossed that line. It was written by a friar, backed by a pope, printed on the new Gutenberg press, and read by lawyers, judges, and magistrates across the continent. The church lit the kindling.
Others brought the fire. But let's be precise about what a trial actually looked like, because the reality is more disturbing than the mythology. You are a woman in a village in the Rhineland in 1520. Your neighbor's cow died. She tells the magistrate she thinks you cursed it. You are brought in for questioning. You deny everything. They tie your hands behind your back and hoist you by your wrists, a technique called strappato, until your shoulders dislocate. They ask again.
You still deny it. They apply the thumb screws. At some point, and this is documented in trial after trial, the pain becomes something your mind cannot contain. You say whatever they need you to say. You confess. And then, as the Malleus instructs, they ask you to name your accomplices. So you name someone. Maybe the woman you argued with last spring. Maybe your neighbor. Maybe in the extremity of the moment, someone you love. And the circle widens.
Before we go further, let me put a number in front of you. 40,000. Some historians say 50,000. Some say 60,000. These are not estimates of accusations. These are estimates of executions. People who went all the way through the machinery. The accusation, the arrest, the torture, the trial, the confession, and came out the other end in flames, or at the end of a rope. 80% of them were women.
And yet the witch trials are still, somehow, imagined by most people as a medieval phenomenon, as something primitive, pre-Enlightenment, belonging to a world before reason. The peak years of execution were 1560 to 1630. That is not the Middle Ages. That is the same era as Shakespeare, as Galileo, as the King James Bible. The witch trials did not happen despite the rise of early modern Europe. In many regions, they happened because of it, because of anxiety about social change, religious upheaval after the Reformation, and communities looking for someone to blame. If this video is opening your eyes to a history you weren't taught, consider subscribing. There is more where this came from. Now let's keep going, because the story gets darker before it gets clearer.
By the early 1600s, the machinery Kramer had assembled was running on its own. It didn't need a pope to keep signing documents. It didn't need a single friar traveling the countryside. It had judges. It had local magistrates. It had neighbors willing to testify against neighbors. And in England, it had a man named Matthew Hopkins, who turned witch hunting into a business. Hopkins was born around 1620 in Suffolk. He was the son of a Puritan minister. He had no formal legal training, no church appointment, no official title. He gave himself one, Witchfinder General.
Between 1645 and 1647, just 2 years, Matthew Hopkins was personally responsible for the execution of somewhere between 200 and 300 people in the county of Essex alone. That is more than the total number executed for witchcraft in England in the previous 100 years. Hopkins charged fees. He charged towns for his services, typically 20 shillings per town, plus expenses.
He developed his own techniques: sleep deprivation, swimming the accused, and a method called watching, where suspects were kept awake for days until they hallucinated or confessed. He published a pamphlet justifying his methods, called The Discovery of Witches, in 1647. He died later that same year, tuberculosis, 26 or 27 years old. He faced no trial, no judgment, no reckoning, at least not in this life. But it gets stranger.
The same years that Matthew Hopkins was working through Essex, the city of Bamberg in the Holy Roman Empire was experiencing something so catastrophic it has its own name in German historical records, the Bamberger Hexenverfolgung, the Bamberg witch persecution.
Between 1626 and 1631, the Prince Bishop of Bamberg, a man named Johann Georg II Fuchs von Dornheim, who history still calls the Witch Bishop, authorized the systematic arrest and execution of approximately 300 people. Not poor women on the margins of society. This time, the targets included wealthy citizens, council members, children as young as 5 years old accused of attending witch sabbaths, and eventually the mayor of the city himself.
Pay attention to this. The trials fed on themselves. Every confession required names. Every set of names generated new arrests. Every new arrest generated new confessions. The judges who ran the proceedings were not all sadists. Some of them were, by every available account, genuinely convinced they were purging their city of genuine evil. And this sincere conviction is one of the most disturbing things about Bamberg. You can look at Matthew Hopkins and see a fraud, a mercenary, a man who found a profitable enterprise in other people's fear. That's horrifying, but it's understandable. The human capacity for self-serving cruelty is something we recognize. But Bamberg forces you to sit with something harder. What do you do with sincere people who sincerely believe they are doing God's work and are wrong? Not cynically wrong, not secretly wrong. Wrong in a way they will take to their own graves convinced of their righteousness. One man tried to answer that question from inside the system. His name was Johann Weir, and he was a physician in the Duchy of Cleves, in what is now Western Germany. In 1563, he published a book called De Prestigiis Daemonum, on the tricks of demons. In it, he argued something that was, for its time, almost unthinkable, that the women being accused and executed for witchcraft were not in league with the devil. They were mentally ill. They were suffering from melancholia, what we might today call severe depression or psychosis. Their own suffering minds were generating the experiences being reported, not the devil. Weir did not deny the existence of the devil. He was not a skeptic in any modern sense. But he said, with precision and with courage, that these women were victims, not perpetrators, and that executing them was not justice. It was cruelty
dressed in theological language. The response was fierce. King James VI of Scotland, who had personally attended torture sessions during the North Berwick trials in 1590, wrote an entire rebuttal book called Daemonology. Jean Bodine, the most respected legal theorist of the age, called Wyer a witch himself. Wyer kept writing.
He did not stop the trials, but he planted something, a seed, a voice that said, "Wait, look again. What if we are wrong?" Now, share this video if you believe that voice matters, because it's the same voice that's needed in every generation. And then stay with me, because we're going back to Bamberg, to the man with the candle, to the letter. Johannes Junius was arrested on the 28th of June, 1628. He was the burgomaster, the mayor, of Bamberg.
A man of 55 years. He had a wife, Dorothea. He had a daughter, Veronica. He had, by every surviving account, lived a respectable and quiet life. He was accused by another prisoner, someone already broken by torture, of attending a witch's sabbath in a local field. Junius denied it. He was brought before the commission. He denied it again. They applied bistropato. He denied it. They applied thumbscrews. He denied it.
They applied leg vices, devices that crushed the bones of the leg incrementally. After several sessions, Johannes Junius confessed. He confessed to things he had not done. He named people he had no reason to name. He did it because he was a human being, and human beings break. He was sentenced to death by burning. And then, in the days between his sentence and his execution, he did something extraordinary. He wrote a letter.
He smuggled it out, sewn into clothing, passed through a guard. Historians aren't certain of the method. And it eventually reached his daughter, Veronica. The letter has been in the state archives of Bamberg for nearly 400 years. He wrote, paraphrased here from the historical German, that he had come into prison innocent, been tortured innocent, and must die innocent.
He wrote that whoever enters the witch prison must become a witch or be tortured until he invents something out of his own head to say. He described the thumbscrews pressing until blood ran from his nails. He wrote that for 4 weeks after the first session, he could not use his hands. He begged his daughter to keep the letter secret, because if the guards found it, he would be tortured again, and the jailers who let it through would be beheaded.
He told her, "Pay the man who delivers this 1 thaler." He told her he had taken several days to write it, because his hands were lame. And he signed it, "Your father, Johannes Junius, will never see you more." He was burned on the 6th of August, 1628. His wife, Dorothea, had been executed the month before. Take a moment with that. A father, burning tomorrow, hands that can barely hold a quill.
Writing to a daughter he will never see again, not to curse his killers, not to rage at God, but to tell her the truth, to make sure somewhere, someone knows I was innocent. I did not confess because I was guilty. I confessed because I was a human being, and human beings break. Now watch what happens next. Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. By this point in history, the witch trials in Europe were already slowing down. Courts were growing skeptical of torture-extracted confessions. The Enlightenment was beginning to push back, but in a Puritan colony in New England, the machine starts up one more time. It begins, as it so often begins, with children. A group of young girls in Salem Village begin having fits, screaming, contorting, claiming they are being tormented by invisible forces. A physician finds no natural cause. The girls begin naming names.
One of the first people they name is a woman named Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados, owned by the local minister, Samuel Parris. Tituba confesses. Historians debate whether she calculated that confession was safer than denial, as a woman with no power in a society that would believe almost anything about her. What we know is that her confession ignited the imagination of the entire community. 19 people were hanged on Gallows Hill before it was over. 5 more died in prison.
And one man, 81 years old, refused to play along at all. Giles Corey had seen enough. He knew that the system had no answer for innocence. If you confessed, you lived, but you were guilty. If you denied, they would convict you. There was no path through. So Giles Corey refused to enter a plea. Under English law, a defendant who refused to plea could be subjected to pressing, laid on the ground, a board placed on the chest, stones added one by one, to make him speak.
Giles Corey spent 2 days under those stones. When they asked him to plead, he said 2 words, more weight. He died on the 19th of September, 1692. They buried him where he lay. He was the last person in American history to be pressed to death. Here is the modern bridge, because this is the part where the history stops being about the past.
You have probably, at some point in your life, been in a room where something wrong was happening, and everyone around you seemed to think it was right. You know that pressure. The way the consensus of a crowd, or an institution, or a community you love and belong to, the way that consensus can make you question what you know to be true with your own eyes. Johannes Junius knew the truth. He held it with broken hands and wrote it down for one person so it would not disappear entirely.
Giles Corey knew the truth, and he chose the weight of the stones over the weight of a false confession. The question this history asks every person watching and every institution, including the church, is simple. It is terrible, and it does not go away. When the crowd is moving in one direction and you know it's wrong, what do you do? So let's bring it home. 3 things to take from this video. The first is the truth about scale and responsibility. Between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed over roughly 300 years. The peak happened not in the depths of the medieval period, but in the early modern era, the same generations that produced the King James Bible and the works of Shakespeare. The institutional church, not every church, not every bishop, not every priest, but the institution at its highest levels, provided the theological framework, the legal manual, and in some cases the direct authorization that made those killings possible. That is a fact. It does not make Christianity false, but it is a fact that honest faith must reckon with, not explain away. The second is what this means for you today. Every one of us lives inside institutions, churches, governments, workplaces, families, communities. Every one of us has encountered moments where the official consensus was wrong, and someone with power was harming someone without it. The witch trials are not a lesson about the distant past. They are a lesson about the perennial human tendency to dress fear in the language of righteousness, and then refuse to look at what's underneath. Faith that cannot examine itself is not faith. It's certainty. And certainty, as Bamberg shows, can build a prison. The third, and this is the one I want to leave you with. Johannes Junius wrote a letter with broken hands the night before he was burned. He didn't write it to change history. He didn't write it because he expected justice. He wrote it because he had a daughter, and he wanted her to know the truth.
and she kept it. "400 years later, you know his name. You know he was innocent.
You know what was done to him, and why, and how. His killers had power for a season. They had a papal bull and a best-selling handbook, and the full authority of church and state behind them. But they could not stop one man with broken hands from writing the truth. Remember his name. Which person in this story will stay with you longest? Johannes Junius, Giles Corey, Johann Weyer, who said stop when everyone around him said continue? Tell me in the comments. I want to know.
And if you believe that honesty about the past is how we build something better, share this. Because the first step to never again is we have to look at this. God keeps no secrets. Neither should we.